Okay, thank you folks for arriving promptly. I'm sure we'll have a few more people drift in over the next few minutes, but we'll make a start. So firstly, a big thank you to all of you for joining us for today's session on COMAH awareness. I'll start with just a few quick words on who we are, and then a few housekeeping points for the meeting before handing you over to Ravi for the main event. So maybe firstly, just who are we? IDEA. If you flick on, Ravi. So IDEA, here at IDEA, we're a process-led multidiscipline engineering consultancy based here in Glasgow. And we're a team of about 30 people spanning the process safety, of course, EC&I, mechanical equipment and piping disciplines. We do a variety of work kind of spanning the whole project life cycle, right through from kind of early concept and feasibility through FEED, detailed design, and right the way through into kind of construction support and commissioning, and then long-term operational support for our clients. So kind of organizations we're working with there are typically in the high hazard and energy intensive industries. That's one of the reasons this COMAH piece is very important to us, but very important to our client base as well. And we're generally providing support in these kind of areas up on the screen. So process engineering, plant design and upgrades, process safety and regulatory compliance, which is today's main topic. Also energy transformation and decarbonisation. And individual elements of kind of multidiscipline engineering support and delivery. So quite a range of stuff, but has given us a good exposure to this topic as kind of our background. So moving on to a few items of housekeeping before we start. You've probably all noticed that you're muted, and that's just to avoid a lot of background noise as we're going through. You should all see a Q&A option at the top. So if you've got questions, feel free to answer them as we go along and put them into the Q&A. We'll come to them and deal with them at the end of the talk. And you can also raise your hand if you want to ask questions at the end. So we'll do that as well. The chat function, we're not going to use that for the questions, but we will be using it for a poll. So there is a wee quiz at the end. It's not an exam. We'll not be reporting your marks back to you, but it's just a good opportunity for a bit of interaction and to see if things are landing. So that will pop up on your screen when we get to that point. Following the session, we will send you out a little CPD certificate each and a quick kind of feedback link because it's really useful for us to get feedback on how this has landed, what worked well, and what we could improve. So if you get the chance to fill that in, that would be much appreciated. So enough of me wittering on. I will hand you over to Ravi. Just a quick few words of introduction first. So Ravi is our process safety director. He's a chartered chemical engineer himself. He's also a professional process safety engineer. And he brings extensive experience across a range of sectors, including pharmaceuticals, energy, mining, chemicals, and distilled spirits. So he's got a lot of experience of the topic he's talking about. And I know from experience, he's very knowledgeable on this and presents it well. So I'm handing you over into good hands. Enjoy the session. As I say, any questions, drop them into the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zach. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody here attending today. Much appreciated. It's great to see a good number of people attending, and also from the attendance sheet, we have seen that you represent a variety of industries, which is very good. I mean, that is what contributes to a rich forum, really. And in the end, of course, as Zach mentioned, we have a questionnaire there where we can have a knowledge check after the presentation is done. Equally, I also mentioned there is a Q&A section where you can post questions and we'll collate them and endeavor to answer them towards the end. So, first things first. As an introductory slide here, now this is an important slide, regulatory requirements and the legal framework. And one thing to mention, I'm going to speak mainly about the UK here, since the COMAH regulations apply to the UK. So first thing, within UK, the health and safety regulatory framework is really a goal-setting framework rather than a prescriptive framework. And the key piece of legislation here is the Health and Safety at Work Act from 1974. That is an act which really imposes a overarching framework which lists out legal duties for employers, essentially to ensure the safety, well-being, health of all employees in the public is as controlled as far as reasonably practicable. Now, looking at the triangle there, I will start at the bottom up and go up the way. So first of all, there are some guidance notes which the Health and Safety Executive publishes. And for the Health and Safety Executive, I'm going to call them HSE going forward in this presentation today. So the HSE publishes guidance notes. For example, HSG 176 on storage of flammable liquids. There is HSG 140, another one, which is again storage of flammable liquids in drums and small containers up to 1,000 liters. Then there are some British standards. For example, there's one there, BS 60079, particularly in relation to hazardous area classification. And then there are several parts to that British standard, part 1 to part 32. And within those parts, there are subparts. For example, for part 10, there is HAC in relation to vapors and gases. Then there is part 10.2, which is in relation to combustible dusts. So guidance notes and standards, they sit at the bottom rung of the pyramid here. These are useful documents which give guidance in terms of how to comply with the regulations which sit further up. So in themselves, per se, these are not legally binding documents. They are guidance. So if you go one notch up now, there is approved code of practice. Again, published by the HSE. For example, L111 is the ACOP, as it's fondly called, ACOP for COMAH. Equally, there is L138, which is a code of practice for DSIR, dangerous substance and explosive atmospheres regulation. Now, these sit one level up above from the guidance notes and standards. Very useful because they set out the framework on how exactly to comply with the regulations. But again, these are approved codes, very useful, but still not legally binding documents. I would pick an example here. ACOPs can be akin to the highway code, for example. This is not a legal document, but the highway code definitely provides rules and regulations and how to comply with them. What is acceptable when driving safely on the road? What is not acceptable? That is where approved codes of practices sit. Further up from there are regulations. And these are legally binding. A variety of regulations that sit under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Some of them are listed there. COMAH, which is the topic for today. DSIR, dangerous substances and explosive atmospheres regulations. Then there is COSH, for example, control of substances hazardous to health. So these are legally binding documents. And when the HSE, being the regulatory body, inspects facilities which come into COMAH, then that is what they look at. If there are gaps against them, then there is a enforcement process that the HSE follows. What they do look at, though, is also whether or not the people have followed standards and approved codes of practices. That is what helps clients to build their compliance up to the regulations. And that is what the HSE also uses to see how the client is complying with the regulations. Okay, so I will move to the next slide here. Looking at compliance framework, etc., it's important to see what is the goalpost here. Now, some of you might be familiar with this drawing. It comes from Reducing Risk, Protecting People, R2P2, which is another publication from the HSE. It's also fondly called the HSE risk carrot. Now, it's important here to understand the picture a little bit. For companies which have operations involving hazardous substances or hazardous activities, then there is an expectation to conduct some form of a risk assessment. There are different approaches to conduct that. People carry out hazard identification exercise, HAZOP, hazard and operability exercise, or other forms of risk assessment. But certainly there is an element of expectation that some risk assessment, be it qualitative, semi-quantitative, or a quantitative, that depends on the level of risk, be conducted. If that level of risk has been identified in the unacceptable region, then really the risk cannot be justified except in extraordinary circumstances, which is the top rung in the risk carrot there. That is classed unacceptable region or intolerable level of risk. The lowest band down below is the band where the risk has been estimated to be below 1E-5 to 1E-6 per year. That is the broadly acceptable region, which is the bottom rung. The one in the middle is where the risk is generally classed as tolerable if ALARP can be demonstrated. ALARP standing for as low as reasonably practicable, meaning the risk is only tolerable if the risk reduction is impracticable or its cost or complexity is grossly disproportionate to the benefit that is expected. Now, that's a demonstration that people need to do. They can still leave the risk where it is, i.e. not implement further reduction measures, but the expectation is that they demonstrate ALARP. There are a number of ways which are commonly used, and one of the most common method for demonstrating ALARP is a cost-benefit analysis. So just to mention that here, that not being the focus for today. The other thing I'll draw your attention to is right in the middle of the picture. Within the risk carrot, if you like, as the risk is reduced, the less proportionately it is necessary to reduce it further. Essentially, what we are saying is the concept of diminishing proportions is shown by the tapering figure there. At the higher end, there are things that you must do. There are things you should do first as compared to the bottom end. That is one of the important interpretation of this picture. Now, one thing to stress, ALARP stands for as low as reasonably practicable. It does not stand for as little as the regulator permits. Now, I'm saying that in jest, but even though people don't mention that as such, they don't document it, but that is one of the approaches I've seen used in the past. That is one of the interpretations, not quite right. It's not as little as the regulator permits. It's as low as reasonably practicable. So with these two introductory slides, the first one on the regulatory framework, and the second is the goalpost, which sets the level of risk. As you can see, this is semi-quantitative, if you like. It does mention thresholds for levels of risk in between broadly acceptable and tolerable, and then between tolerable and intolerable regions. Okay. I will move next to the topic for today, which is COMAH. COMAH regulation stands for Control of Major Accident Hazards. And there are two key references that I've listed down at the bottom there, the bottom left of the screen. They are free to download from the HSE's webpage, and they're very useful. One of them is the approved code of practice, L111, and the other one is a guide that the HSE has published specifically for establishments which are new entrants into the COMAH regime. And I'll come to that in a couple of examples further on. Okay. So the basic aim of the COMAH regulations is to prevent major accidents involving dangerous substances and mitigate the effects of those accidents should they occur. Now, in simple words, it's a two-line sentence, but it's very important. There needs to be a definition of what major accidents are. There needs to be an understanding of what dangerous substances mean. And then there needs to be an understanding of the consequences of those. So it's very useful to understand each of them, and we'll go through them today. So when did the COMAH regulations first appear? Back in 1999. Prior to that, it was COMAH, Control of Industrial Major Accident Hazards. But for the last 25, 26 years, it's the COMAH regime, last updated in 2015. Within the COMAH regulations, there are two tiers, each with different requirements. And the tiering system is determined by the amount, the volume, or masses rather, of dangerous materials against their corresponding thresholds as set out in the regulation. And there are tables for those thresholds down below in those two references that you see at the bottom of the screen. Okay, and we'll come to those thresholds in a minute. But I'll mention it again, these L111 approved code of practice, as well as the other document listed there, are free to download on the agency's webpage. They're very useful if you are working in a COMAH facility, or indeed if you anticipate entering the COMAH regime. So we've looked at the regulatory goalpost. We've looked at thresholds for risk. We've looked at what COMAH stands for. Now let's see whether or not COMAH applies to your facility. How does one decide? So there are thresholds to meet. And again, the flowchart is here. Equally, there is a similar flowchart as in the references there. So starting at the very top, are your activities exempt? There's a list of activities which are exempt, and then there are a list of activities which are not exempt. So if you are exempt, you go to the right-hand side, the green arrow, you're not a COMAH site. The important bit for today also would be the one on the left. If your activities aren't exempt, then you look at COMAH Schedule 1. In particular, you look at parts 2 and 3 of Schedule 1. That's where the upper tier thresholds have been mentioned for materials. So that branch there on the top left, which dangerous substances do you have? Are any of the listed dangerous substances present on your facility or likely to be present? If no, you go to the far right and answer the other question. Is there a likelihood of any of them being formed? If no, you go to the right, you're not COMAH. Back to the left, if you have them, then how much do you have? Are you in exceedance of the upper tier threshold as published in parts 1 and 2 and parts 3 of Schedule 1? If yes, you are a upper tier COMAH site. I'm looking at the left branch here coming down the way. If you do not exceed the upper tier threshold, then you work across the way. You walk across the way and look at the thresholds from lower tier, which are in columns 3 of part 2 or part 3 of Schedule 1. If you are in excess of the lower tier threshold, then you are a lower tier COMAH site. Equally, if you have a variety, if you have a number of different storage volumes of dangerous materials as established in the COMAH listing, then is the aggregation greater than equal to 1? And we'll come to some examples. Then also you come under COMAH. So let's try to bring this to life a little bit. But the short summary of this before we move on is that you first need to establish whether your activities are exempt or not, then look at the materials if you have them present, or indeed as a part of your manufacturing process, if you're running a chemical process, you can produce some of them. Then also you need to check the properties of those materials, the volumes of those materials against the thresholds. And depending on which thresholds they breach, either the lower tier or the upper tier, this then tells you you are a lower tier establishment or an upper tier establishment. Okay. Next, we talked of threshold quantities here. They're also called qualifying quantities. So the approved code of practice publishes these tables here, which I'm going to show you in a minute. They come in two different types. Number one, part one is categories of dangerous materials. Obviously, you could have innumerable chemicals, flammable, toxics, corrosives, harmful to the atmosphere, hazardous to health, etc. You have n number of them. So Stopping short of listing all of those out, the HSE has categorized them. First one, this table is again reproduced from one of those references as you've seen on multiple screens. Remember, this is categories. Typically, broadly, there are three categories. The dangerous materials that impact health, the ones involving health hazards, classed as a H, and within them there is a H1 and then there is a H2, acute toxic, chronic toxic, etc. And that information comes from the CAS number or the material safety data sheet. That is where you know what this particular material is and what category it falls under. Second category is physical hazards, typically explosives, explosive gases, explosive solids, oxidizing solids, flammable gases, flammable liquids, and I'll come to that in a minute again. This one here. So there are several categories as I just mentioned. And the other point to note here is at the very top. Each of these categories has a corresponding threshold volume, also called qualifying quantity. These are in metric tons. The first column, the column in the middle, is lower tier thresholds. And the column on the far right is the upper tier threshold. So first was health hazards. Second is materials having physical hazards. And third is dangerous materials having environmental hazards. These are the three broad categories within which the bulk of materials sit. Now, the other thing we noticed is we have quite a bit of representation. Again, yourself, you're from various different industries and operations. And we also saw some people from the spirit industry here. Therefore, it might be pertinent to highlight where ethanol sits here in this classification in COMAH. So ethanol sits here. It's classed as a P5C flammable liquid. And the corresponding qualifying quantity or the thresholds for ethanol is 5,000 tons. So if you have a facility which has more than 5,000 tons of ethanol, you are in lower tier COMAH. If you exceed 50,000 tons, then you come into the upper tier regime. If you are below 5,000, obviously you do not come into COMAH because of P5C, okay? And that's an estimate there. 5,000 tons near about approximates to 6 million liters of ethanol. That's the lower tier threshold. And the upper tier threshold is 63 million liters of ethanol. Okay. So remember, top left again, this is categories, okay? Health category, physical hazards, environmental hazards, and other hazards. The second table that the HSE has published in the ACOP is named materials. These are the most commonly used materials that people employ in their manufacturing processes. It could be solvents, it could be reactants, it could be washing liquids, it could be different for a variety of purposes. But these are the named materials. And again, this is an extract of the table. Okay? This is not exhaustive list here. The table is a bit longer, but for clarity, I put them here. So some of the materials listed are, as you can see there, bromine or chlorine. Fluorine's there as well, and row number 13. Anhydrous ammonia, that sits there. 50 tons is the lower tier threshold, and 200 tons is the upper tier threshold. Okay, so these are named substances. So we have got an understanding, or rather an introduction, of the framework, then the COMAH thresholds, which are the qualifying quantities here. Let us try to bring them to life a little bit. See what we do with this information. We had the flow chart there just to check whether or not you are COMAH. These are the thresholds. What do we do with this information? So this is what you do with this information. There's a formula on the left, but I'll try to summarize here at the right here. Q, lowercase q, is your inventory on site of a particular dangerous material. Uppercase Q is the qualifying quantity. If it's QL, it's lower tier. If it's QH, it's upper tier. So if the aggregation of all your Q over Q is greater than 1, then you are upper tier. Or indeed, if there are individual materials stored in volumes greater than the upper tier threshold, then also you're upper tier. Likewise, your inventory divided by the qualifying category, qualifying inventory, add all of them up. If you are greater than 1, then that means you are lower tier. Or indeed, if you have individual quantities exceeding the lower tier threshold, then also you are lower tier. So what I've done in a couple of slides coming up is to, again, I use the term bring them to life, so let's try to bring them to life now. An example, a worked example of how we apply the thresholds and these formula to see whether or not a particular facility is in COMAH, or is it, if yes, lower tier, or indeed upper tier. Let's get some couple examples and see if that makes sense. So, COMAH tier assessment. Example 1. We have a pharmaceutical manufacturer that has, and when I say have, that has 50,000 liters. That's an important point also. By has, the HSE means you bring in, i.e. materials coming in, being stored, being processed, being produced, and ready to leave. The entire inventory of that particular material whilst on your premises, that counts for the site inventory. So that is what has means, okay? So a pharmaceutical manufacturer has these many liters, 50,000 liters of ethanol, 50,000 liters of diisopropyl ether, 500 kilograms, less than a ton, of arsenic trioxide, and then some other flammable liquids, class P5B liquids, stored on site. So you have this inventory of chemicals, of dangerous materials on this particular site. Will this site be a COMAH site? If yes, what tier will that be? The other point to mention here before the worked example is typically you have storage tanks where you store your dangerous materials, let's call them flammable liquids. And it's important to recognize that the inventory is the maximum volume that can be stored. That's the maximum inventory, rather than the normal operating level or the alarm level, or indeed the level switch high or overfill protection system, which could be set at 85%, for example. That is not what you have to use. You have to use the full vessel volume together with the pipeline inventory. That is your total inventory that you use for the calculation. So based on these numbers, let's run through a quick calculation, see what we can do. So depending on the materials, we haven't identified any which have acute toxicity or health category. So the broad focus really is the physical tier. So first one, 50,000 liters of ethanol, applying a density of 0.8 of 800 kgs per meter cube, is near about 40 tons of ethanol. Remember, ethanol is P5C, and the threshold for P5C is 5,000 tons. So we are well below 5,000 tons. And we are certainly below 50,000 tons. So based on the P5C ethanol, this site is not in COMAH. Let's look at the second one, diisopropyl ether. That diisopropyl ether is a P5A material. And for P5A material, the threshold is much lower. The threshold is 10 tons for lower tier and 50 tons for upper tier. So for 50,000 liters, you have about 37 tons of this material, which exceeds the lower tier threshold of 10. So this facility is in the lower tier of COMAH. We apply the next one, P5B, 50,000 liters of P5B. This middle row here, 40 tons, which is well below 50 tons and 200 tons, lower tier and upper tier. So this site is or does come under lower tier COMAH based on the physical hazards category. But remember, you have to look at all three, physical hazards, health hazards, environmental hazards, and also named substances. So this site has a named substance here, arsenic trioxide, about half a ton, 500 kilograms. At the bottom here, the tables that you saw there, that mentions the threshold values, the qualifying quantities for arsenic trioxide. It is 0 for lower tier and 0.1, i.e. 100 kilograms for upper tier. Therefore, this particular site exceeds the upper tier threshold, and so it's an upper tier COMAH establishment. One final point here, which you might have recognized, is even if this arsenic trioxide inventory were 10 kilograms, this site would still be under COMAH because the threshold quantity or qualifying quantity in lower tier is 0. So any amount of arsenic trioxide at a facility takes it straight into COMAH. Okay. So this is the upper tier COMAH establishment. Another example, a distillery has 7 million liters of ethanol and certain number, 50,000 liters of P5B liquids, and then 1,000 liters of diesel, typically used for firing boilers. That's very typical of 1,000 liters, 5,000 liters, that kind of quantity. So same question again, is this a COMAH site? If yes, what tier? So let's have a look there. In this case, ethanol is P5C, as we just saw, and 7 million liters comes to about 5,500 tons, which exceeds the lower tier threshold, whereas the other two don't, P5 and diesel, they don't. Therefore, this facility is a lower tier COMAH establishment. I have another example here, and that's an interesting one because this does apply increasingly to operations. So a fine chemicals manufacturer has an inventory on site of, again, 50,000 liters of ethyl acetate. And again, like the last example, 1,000 liters of diesel. And now the site is proposing to install a hydrogen boiler on the site with a site inventory of hydrogen, about 6,000 kilograms, so 6 tons of hydrogen. Will this site now be a COMAH site? If yes, what tier? So let's have a look. With the P5B ethyl acetate, it is just under 49 tons, which is just under 50, and so sub-COMAH. Likewise, for diesel, it is way under. Whereas the hydrogen takes it to lower tier. 6 tons inventory against 5 tons of lower tier threshold. That takes it to a lower tier COMAH site. So these are simplistic examples. The other thing to mention also is you might have a few different materials within, say, a P5 category, P5.3 or P5C or P5A, in which case the aggregation rule from before, you add up the material with the qualifying quantity for that material, then inventory for the second material divided by the qualifying quantity for the second material. You add all of them up, and then you compare them against one. One thing to mention, though, is it's quite obvious, but it's easily missed. When a particular site, some sites have different numerous operations, one in this part of the site, one in that plant, another in this factory on the site. A particular chemical might be used in very specific parts of the process, stage 3 of operation, for example, which is what takes the material into a particular tier of COMAH. But the recognition should very well be that once you're in COMAH, the regulations apply to the entire site, even where that material is not used. You might have a different manufacturing facility at one end of the site and another one at another end, but the whole facility comes under the COMAH regulations. Okay. Now, we looked at regulation, we looked at threshold, we looked at qualifying quantities, we looked at a couple examples, and we have now established we are in COMAH. What does that mean? What does being in COMAH mean? What responsibilities does the HSE levy on yourself? So if you're in the lower tier, The requirements are that you notify to the competent authority, which is the HSE and COMAH in Scotland or Environment Agency in England. You obtain a hazardous substances consent. You prepare a major accident prevention policy. In a sense, the expectation is that you take all measures necessary to prevent a major accident. If you remember back to the slides at the start, what was the aim of COMAH? Prevent major accidents or limit the consequence if an accident were to occur. Now that is lower tier. If your dangerous substances volumes are such that you are in upper tier, then you have additional responsibilities put on you. So all duties placed on lower tier sites, plus these others. Prepare a safety report, a detailed safety report which identifies the site and the operations that are done on the site, control measures to prevent major accidents, mitigation measures that limit the effect of an accident. So it's a detailed safety report that needs prepared and submitted. There's expectation also that you prepare internal and external emergency plans and then provide information to the neighbors, both industrial and general public, regarding what to do with an emergency. So these are additional duties set out for upper tier establishments. And we'll look at them in detail now. So first one, notification. When to notify, and also what to notify, what do we tell? So we'll come to that here in this slide. So when to notify. The third example we looked at, remember, were you were an existing COMAH site, and then you are preparing an expansion or you are increasing your throughput or volumes on site. And that inventory might likely take you into COMAH. So there are 4 different reasons there. So proposed construction of a new establishment, quantities equal to or in excess of COMAH threshold, new site, 3 to 6 months before the construction begins. So you need to inform the competent authority that you are doing this. Okay. Equally, existing non-COMAH site, increasing its inventory, which is then likely to take them into COMAH. So again, it says reasonable time, but between 3 and 6 months is what generally expected. Okay. And lastly, existing non-COMAH site due to changes in material classification. For example, nitric acid some years ago, about 10 or 9 years ago, nitric acid 70% changed classification. And there was a notification that was meant due for all suppliers to send to their clients. So either the classification could change or COMAH Schedule 1 threshold limits change. That is another reason why some establishments come under the COMAH purview or change tiering. Secondly, what to notify. You know you're in COMAH, you need to notify. What do you tell the HSE? So name and address, as it says there, details of the dangerous materials present, the quantities and the physical form, brief description of what operations the site conducts with these dangerous materials, and an understanding of some level of detail and overview of the major accidents on the site. Lastly, how to notify. So there's an Excel-based form that either you can print out or you can fill in online on the HSE's webpage, COMAH notifications -HSE. If you search that, you'll find it. You fill it online and then submit it by email to comah.notifications@hse.gov.uk. And these timelines you see on the left-hand side. Okay. Let me move to the second responsibility, hazardous substances consent. Now it's a planning, HSE is a planning control, which enables the hazardous substances authority to consider whether this particular establishment handling these materials in these quantities is at an appropriate level of risk to the surrounding communities, including people and the environment. Now, the important point is the local hazardous substances authority, they are the ones who grant these consent forms, not the HSE. The HSE is a consulted body. Likewise, the EA or the COMAH, they are statutory consulted bodies for making decisions on consent applications. Okay. The next requirement is major accident prevention policy. Now it's a document. I say a document We have seen variants of them. We have seen a one-pager, we have seen front and back 2 pages, and we have seen about 8 pages long. But really, it's not full COMAH safety report. Remember, a MAP, Major Accident Prevention Policy, is to be prepared for lower tier establishments also. Those are the ones which do not require a detailed COMAH safety report. Upper tier do. So a MAP document, it provides an overview of the organization's systems for preventing major accidents. So what is the safety management system that they have? How do they identify risks? How are personnel set out? What are the levels of operational controls? Do you have manual controls, instrumented functions, trips and alarms, etc.? Are major accident hazards identified? If yes, how are they responded to? And then, does the organization have a safety management system which requires a monitoring and an audit and assurance function? All this needs to be detailed out in the MAP, Major Accident Prevention Policy. And just for clarification, I said at the bottom, top there, safety management system. In COMAH speak, when we say safety, it also includes environmental protection. Remember, the HSE, together with the CPA in Scotland and the EA in England, constitute the competent authority, CA. So the terminology is such that in COMAH speak, safety includes safety and environment. Now, these three here, notification, number 1, hazardous substance consent, number 2, and MAP, number 3. These are core duties or responsibilities set out for lower tier establishments. Upper tier have additional duties, as we saw there. Prepare a COMAH safety report. We have looked at that just now. Now, the purpose, as we said, the expectation is that the organization demonstrates to the HSE that they have taken all measures necessary to prevent a major accident or to limit the consequences if they were to occur. So how it applies? So new upper tier establishments need to prepare a pre-construction and pre-operation safety report. And we saw the timelines there in a couple of slides before. What does the competent authority use these for? Essentially, the CA uses this to ascertain whether the operators have provided all information, all required information that they can then use to assess whether the major hazards have been identified correctly and mitigated, controlled adequately. The competent authority also then prepares a site intervention plan. They bring out certain topics and they visit the site to verify the contents of the COMAH safety report. The other thing to mention also is under upper tier, you submit a COMAH safety report. However, the HSE's intervention or competent authority's intervention on the site also applies to lower tier. Only that they don't need to prepare a COMAH safety report, but then typically on a quarterly basis, the HSE visits lower tier establishments. Either number 1, if it's a new entrant into the COMAH regime, then it's a first introductory visit followed by an intervention plan, as they call it. Or indeed, it could be a follow-up of a previous visit. Or indeed, the HSE might also visit an establishment in the event of an incident notification, incident or an accident, something which has come under radar, for example. Then the HSE quite typically goes to the site to establish why that has happened. Were there things that have failed? Essentially, they try to ascertain whether there is an established basis of safety and whether any of the components of the basis of safety had failed in that instance for that incident to occur. So the HSE does have not only guidance, but also regulatory powers and also enforcement powers with them. So the first additional duty for upper tier is to prepare a COMAH safety report. Another one is prepare and test. That's the important bit. An emergency plan. Really, the purpose is to deal with on-site consequences of a major incident, and we'll come to off-site in a minute. Okay, which is here. supply information to local authorities and the public. And the expectation also is that they test out a off-site emergency response plan. And typically exercises are done once in the 5-year cycle, because that needs demonstrated and recorded in the COMAH safety report, and typically involving the local authority, fire, police, and on occasions, the regulator. I've seen that happen as well. Why the public information? People could be affected by an accident at a COMAH establishment because of the nature of the materials or the operations that they do with those materials. There could be events which have consequences outside the site boundary. And that is where consequence modeling comes into picture. That is something that the agency also expects of upper tier establishments where there are major accident hazards, MAHs. So there is an expectation to do some form of a quantitative risk assessment, especially if there are off-site consequences. Yeah. Right. COMAH quiz time. Everyone loves a quiz, especially on a Thursday. So let's have a look here. So I should mention here that I'll present some questions and then we have a poll for yourself to respond to. So it makes it easier, it makes it a bit interactive as well. Okay. So first question, which two UK bodies jointly enforce COMAH? Is it the HSE and the Environment Agency of SEPA in Scotland, DEFRA and local authorities, BEI, HSE and the local fire authorities, or BEIS, because the Department of Energy and Industry and Ofgem. So please feel free to respond in the poll, which might appear on your screen now. Yeah, so if you poll and submit, that will be useful. All right, if everyone has got the time to respond to the first question, let us move to the second one. The first one was a bit of a starter. So second one now, let's have a look. What's the key difference between lower tier and upper tier COMAH sites? So A, lower tier are exempt from MAP and notification. Upper tier sites require a safety report and detailed emergency planning. C is lower tier must submit annual reports to the regulator. Or D, is it upper tier sites are only regulated by local authorities? So again, please feel free to respond in the poll there. All right, right. The third one is a bit different. So let's come to that now. Number 3. There are 2 greenfield COMAH sites sitting quite close to each other. They are located within 1 kilometer of each other. One of them has a large inventory of toxic gases. The other one has an inventory of flammable liquids. So if you're in a position of consultancy, what would be the most important consultancy-based advice? Is it suggest relocation of one site immediately, or assess potential domino effects and advise on joint risk mitigation, or recommend separate emergency response drills for each of the sites? So again, there'll be a poll before you. So please respond there. Okay, and at the end of this, we'll collect the responses and then we'll go through the answers here, okay? So number 4 now. A particular client operates a lower tier COMAH site storing flammable solvents. They plan to double their storage capacity, which may push them into upper tier classification. And again, if you're in the position of being a consultant, what would be the first consultancy advice or action you would recommend? Advise the client to immediately prepare a full COMAH safety report, or review the new inventory against the COMAH qualifying quantities, or notify the local authority, or focus on updating insurance coverage. What's the first consultancy action or advice? First is important, and a hint. Okay, so at this stage, I think in the chat we get an understanding of the responses here as well. Trying to see here, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3. Okay, so for the first one, we have got a 100%. So I come to the answers here, by the way. Which two UK bodies? So correct, I think 100%, everyone answered correctly. HSE and the Environment Agency, or SEPA, they jointly enforce COMAH. They're called competent authority together. Next one then, what's the difference between upper tier and lower tier? Now, in this case, we have got 94% of the people responding correctly. So upper tier sites require a safety report and detailed emergency planning. The lower tier sites, the first one there, are exempt. They're not exempt. Lower tier do require to notify and prepare a map. So the answer is B here. Upper tier sites require a detailed safety report and emergency planning. Third one down, we had 2 greenfield COMAH sites located close to each other, one storing toxics and the other flammables. What would be the most important consulting advice there? So the answer, everyone answered correctly. We have 100% correct response to that one. Assess the potential domino effects and advise on joint risk mitigation. We have seen that happen in the past. We have seen that being done, a joint risk mitigation. And the domino effects, it has a direct bearing on the offsite consequences from QRAs, etc., and the emergency response planning, external emergency response planning. There are people who do that in a joint fashion. And lastly, a client who wishes to double the storage capacity, which may push them into upper tier classification. Okay. So it's the may bit here. And the other bit important, what's the first consultancy action or advice? The first thing is to ascertain whether they are indeed entering COMAH. So review the threshold quantities, aggregates on the site versus the threshold quantities, and establish whether they are in lower tier or upper tier. And if they are, then notify the authority. So we have a 93% correct response here. So by and large, we are near about 93, 96, 100% responses, which indicates 2 things: a great uptake and understanding, and also some measure of clear delivery. But coming back here, now we have this Q&A. So this is the time where feel free to put in your questions. And this is the time I will mute here. I'll let us collate the questions in the background, and I'll try to answer them if you have any questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple of good ones already. Feel free to enter more or to raise your hand if you want to ask. So I'll just start us off, Ravi, with a couple of good ones. So from Rory, I've got when looking at the kind of threshold assessment, is there a weighting factor based on the concentration you're storing the dangerous substance at? So, for example, ethanol, is it different if it's stored at 60% versus 40%?
Yes. So the detailed table that does give you the quantities. So the short answer is yes. And the example I gave, I mentioned there for 2015 time, nearly over 10 years time, it was nitric acid 70% that changed classification. So there is quite clear guidance on concentrations. So short answer.
So I think.
Yeah, carry on.
Sorry, yeah. So one of the things to watch, Rory, as Ravi's touched, is it can change the characteristic, effectively the category of the material. So, so it's not it effectively can become a different dangerous substance.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And also, not only that, I mean, I'll draw your attention to this here, the middle slide, P5B flammable liquids. So they could have a flash point of less than 60, but handled above their flash point or handled above their boiling point. So there are conditions there as well.
It's like you've anticipated the next excellent question, Ravi. So,
all right, okay.
From Alan, their proposed process uses a P5C liquid. However, much of the process will be hot. How do they decide when the temperature is high enough for it to move up to a P5B?
Yes, so this table here that you see is an extract. The details are in the L111 ACOP. That is where it tells you the guidance on when it changes, when the operating conditions change the threshold. And I also mentioned here at this point that the other ACOP, I know we are doing COMAH, but a very closely related one to that question in particular is L138 on dangerous substance and explosive atmospheres regulation on DSEER. And one common question we get is around diesel or heavy fuel oil. Is that a dangerous material or not? So diesel is quite clearly identified as a petroleum product, and it is. Whether it is classed flammable or not, that's another thing. So whether it is P5B or P5A or which category, then that is down to its flash point and the operating conditions. So typically for diesel, it's not classed as from a DSEER point of view, as something we consider normally. However, if diesel is transferred, say, for example, from a road truck into a storage tank, and you have a leak from a gasket, which then forms a mist or a spray around the flange, then those do have a zone around them from a hazardous area classification point of view. So essentially, mists or sprays, they ignite at much lower temperatures than the flash point. So to come back to your question, L111 does give guidance on change of operating parameters and therefore thresholds.
Yeah, definitely worth a close look. There are tricky ones sometimes. It can be a bit nuanced, can't it?
That's right.
A couple more questions come in, Ravi. So from Babiaf, sorry if I've not pronounced that right. If we're moving on to an existing COMAH site owned and operated by another bigger company, whilst we operate on our own within their site, where does our responsibility stand? And that's a good one and probably increasingly common over the last few years.
Yes. So in that case, it's first of all the notification to the competent authority, and then together with them establishing the site boundaries. Is it classed as a factory within a factory, for example? Then there are instances we have seen that there is an upper tier compound within a broader lower tier facility, lower tier site. So the short answer is notify and then take the HSE's advice.
Yeah, and I think the nuance to that is it's a COMAH establishment is on a kind of company basis, not on a site basis. So you can have multiple COMAH establishments on the same site, and they're all regulated separately, but it's really important to cooperate. Because as touched on in the quiz, there's the cross-boundary effects and domino effects to consider. So the emergency planning and stuff has to be done jointly.
Quite right.
And that would apply, of course, you could be a lower tier or with an upper tier neighbor, for example.
That's right. And we have seen in the past, in example, say oil terminals, it's quite common there. The refinery sits on one end where the storage terminal is across the road. So the refining operations, they are not COMAH with the storage terminal there across the road. They could be upper tier. And then is the off-site consequences piece, the domino effects. So it's important for the upper tier establishment to make sure everybody else in the impact zone are notified.
The next one I've got from Jamie is, for a new site or development, which comes first, the hazardous substance consent application or the notification to the competent authority?
Typically the notification first, because that establishes, once you have a notification to the competent authority, they advise you to do your COMAH aggregation calculation to establish whether you are a COMAH site. And once you're a COMAH site, then the consent duty applies to you, hazardous substance consent. So notification would come first. The point to note also is that the notification goes to the competent authority, the HSE, whereas the consent application goes to the local authority, not the HSE. Just to clarify, two different things going to different places.
Yeah, it's a good point. Is it worth noting to be careful about timings there?
Yeah.
Because you're going to need that if you are under it, you're going to need that hazardous substances consent in place before you start, as it were.
Before you start, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
There was a follow-up question from Jamie there on if the plans are phased. So if it's a phased development, any application, any advice on how you might approach that in terms of the applications and notifications?
Yes. So what we have seen typically done, certainly in terms of HSE's consent, is they apply for the end of phase, i.e. end of all phases volumes. Generally, it's quicker and more efficient. However, that's the consent point of view. However, the safety report point of view, if you're talking of upper tier, then those could be in stages. Say pre-construction of the first phase, then operation phase. Likewise, pre-construction of the second phase, and then the operation phase. They could be staged. So in principle, they could be in stages, but we have seen consent applications certainly done to cover the entire volume, including the future ones as well. That's something we have seen in our experience.
Yeah, that gives you that kind of readiness, doesn't it? I've got one more in the Q&A here. I'm just noting in terms of time, we are at our time. So
yeah.
I'll ask this one anyway, but understood if people need to head off, that's not a problem. So Stephen has asked, and it is a classic, should you, when you're looking at those thresholds, and we talked about the volumes to use and it being the maximum, should it be the working tank volume, the high volume, or the full gross overfill volume when you're working out your maximum inventory capacity, basically?
Yeah. No, not the working volume, not the high level switch volume. It's the full tank or vessel capacity, including the pipework inventory. So all of it. That's something, that's what the HSE are quite keen on. It's how much you can hold rather than how much do you normally hold.
Okay, and so for anything below that, you're going to need a robust justification as to why it cannot be more.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, that's for questions in the chat. If anyone does want to stay on, we'll stay on for a few minutes if anyone's got any further questions. But I'll take this opportunity now to thank everyone for joining us. I'll remind you, I'll send out the certificates and a feedback form to everybody. So yeah, please come back to us on those. But on behalf of everyone, Ravi, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, and thanks to everybody for attending. I hope it was useful.
Pleasure. Thanks, everybody.